In the forgotten corner of this world, there was a book that wasn't written, but rather materialized. A book whose pages no one opened without being swallowed by the words before they themselves were swallowed. There, where no time can be measured and no mind can be fixed, the story begins. A man thought curiosity was merely a feeling, before discovering it was a black hole. A hole that pulls you in until you perish, then leaves you alive to suffer. Tonight, I will not tell a story of victory, nor escape, nor salvation. I will tell of a return to the beginning, of eyes that see symbols everywhere, and of a language not created by humans, a language that whispers in the ear. You are neither alive nor dead. You simply continue to fall. So if you are ready to cross this threshold, then blame no one but yourself when you discover that the end is only the first chapter. Jack, a young man in his late 20s, works as a graphic designer from home. He lives alone in a small, quiet third-floor apartment with faded walls and a heavy silence. Jack isn't very sociable, and his social circle is limited. His work is his only refuge, and he usually works at night. One cold evening, while Jack was finishing revisions to a new client's project, he heard a soft knock at the door. Not a normal knock. The sound was muffled, like a tap from a gloved hand. He went to the door and opened it slowly, but there was no one in the hallway. Just an old, medium-sized wooden box, dirty round the edges and scratched as if it had been dragged around for years. There was no return address. No address. Just the box. Jack took it inside and placed it on the table. The box was strangely cold, as if it contained something metallic. He opened it carefully. Inside, he found an old rotary phone, the kind used in the 1970s. Its color was a dull black, and its cord was worn, but there was little dust on it, as if someone had recently cleaned it. Next to the phone was a small folded piece of paper, written in strange, squiggly handwriting, almost illegible. But Jack could make out one sentence clearly. "Answer when it rings." He laughed awkwardly. He thought it was just a joke from a friend, but nobody knew his new address. He placed the phone on a shelf near his desk, tossed the paper into a drawer, and went back to his work. As midnight approached, the apartment began to get cold. The air grew heavy, as if all the windows had been opened, even though they were tightly closed. Jack ignored it. He continued working under the light of his computer screen, alone. At 2:37 a.m., the phone rang. A long, dry, strange ring. Not like the old phone rings he knew. This one was deeper, like a recording from inside a large underground room. Jack froze. He stared at the phone from a distance. He didn't want to answer, but the sentence he'd found on the note kept coming back to him. Answer when it rings. He moved closer slowly. His hand trembled. He picked up the receiver. Silence was the first thing he heard. Complete silence, as if the line was open to a void. Then a distant, faint, indistinct whisper began. Not the whisper of one person, but several voices, as if a group were talking in a cramped room behind thick walls. Jack tried to make out the words, but the whispers were fragmented. Suddenly, amidst the whispers, another voice came, close, clear, gruff. "You're not alone." Jack froze. Before he could even think, he heard knocking. But the knocking wasn't on the door. It was coming from inside his house. 3 knocks behind his bedroom door. Then a louder knock, as if someone wanted to get out, not come in. Jack turned around quickly. The bedroom door was closed, and he was sure it had been open all night. The phone was still pressed against his ear, the whispers growing louder, closer, as if the caller could hear his breathing. Then came another voice, low but very clear. "When you open the door, you'll see why we sent you." The call ended. The phone went silent. The knocking behind the door intensified, louder, closer, until the painting on the walls shook. Jack took a step back, then stopped. A very faint sound came from under his door, like something crawling. Jack didn't sleep that night. He sat on the floor until sunrise, his back against the wall, his eyes fixed at his bedroom door, from which he'd heard knocks and whispers. For hours, the door hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound since the last contact. But the fear remained constant, standing like someone watching him in the darkness. With the first light of day, Jack slowly rose. He thought everything he'd experienced during the night had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. He tried to convince himself of that, to forget the whispers and the voice saying, "You're not alone." But when he turned toward the door, he froze completely. The door wasn't the same. It had been an old door, light wood, with a small brass handle. Now it was noticeably darker, as if someone had painted it while he slept. The wood was rough, full of scratches. The handle had changed entirely. It was longer, metallic, and unnaturally cold. A coldness like the one he'd felt when he first touched the wooden box. Hesitantly, Jack reached out and touched the handle. The cold was painful, as if the metal had been frozen for hours. He quickly withdrew his hand, then mustered his courage and grasped the handle again. He pressed and tried to open the door. The door swung open easily, but behind it, there was no room. There was a wall, a gray cement wall without a single mark, without any sign that it had been built recently. Jack took 2 steps back. His heart began to race. This was impossible. He was certain this room had always been there, a small room with shelves and his old work tools. He had gone into it almost every day. A wall couldn't have appeared overnight. He brought his face close to the wall and touched its surface. It was cold, just as cold as the handle. A strange smell emanated from it, the smell of old dampness, as if the wall had been transported from somewhere else. He left the room quickly and headed to the kitchen to get a drink of water. His mouth was dry, his hands trembling. But he stopped abruptly when he heard the sound. A light scratch. Then another scratch. Then a series of scratches, as if something with long claws was scratching the cement from the inside. The sound was coming from behind the wall. Jack stood motionless, staring at the open door and the wall behind it. The scratches were getting deeper, clearer, closer, and a very faint sound, like a gasp or a slow exhalation, began to emerge from behind the cement. Something was there, something alive, something wanted to get out. Then the phone rang. Its ring was deep, heavy, like it was deeper than yesterday. One ring, another, a third. Jack ignored it. He didn't even go near it. The phone was on the shelf, gleaming a dull color as if waiting for the right moment. It rang, then stopped. Jack breathed. But only 10 seconds later, it rang again, this time louder and faster. The phone was vibrating violently on the shelf, even though it wasn't a modern phone. Jack shouted, "I'm not answering! Leave me alone!" But deep down he knew that the phone wasn't just any phone, and that the person or thing calling knew exactly what was happening behind the wall. The scratching stopped abruptly. Then came a single sound, a single movement, a loud thump from inside the wall, so much so that dust rained down from above. The phone rang for the third time, a long ring, and provocative, and confident. Jack was beginning to realize that ignoring it wouldn't help. The phone rang again. This time, the ringing wasn't like before. It was faster, louder, as if it were pounding right on Jack's nerves. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His fear of the scratching thing behind the wall was now greater than his fear of the phone. Jack approached the rotary phone, lifting the receiver with a trembling hand. But he heard nothing. Not a whisper, not a breath, not a sound behind him. A heavy silence, but it wasn't ordinary silence. It was a silence he felt, as if someone was sitting in the same room waiting for him to notice his presence. And before he could say a word, his smartphone suddenly vibrated on the table. There was no call, not a notification. Instead, the screen filled with new photos appearing one after another in rapid succession, as if someone were sending them directly from a camera that wasn't there. Jack shouted in a low voice, "What is this?" He opened the photos. The shock hit his chest before it hit his mind. The photos were taken inside his house, but from strange angles he'd never noticed before. Photos taken on top of the wardrobe, behind the sofa, from the top of the ceiling, angles no human could reach without a ladder or equipment. Worse still, in every photo, there were long shadows moving in the background. Human shadows, but taller than a normal person and slanted unnaturally. No detail, just a black shape, but its size was unsettling. In one of the photos, Jack himself appeared, asleep on his stomach on the bed. His body relaxed normally, but next to him, at the edge of the bed, stood a dark figure, almost 2 meters tall, its shoulders hunched, its head tilted as if watching his breathing. Its form was still, but slightly tilted towards him as if about to touch him. Jack began to tremble. How were these photos taken? Who was in his house? And why didn't he wake up? He turned to the next image. His heart stopped for a moment. It was a picture of the room's door, which had changed color and grown darker. But in the picture, the door wasn't a wall. The door was wide open, and inside wasn't a room. It was pitch black, so black that nothing could be seen. Not the blackness of darkness, but a deep, profound blackness, as if the door opened to a place devoid of any light. At the far end of the image, something seemed to emerge from the depths of the blackness, just a long, thin hand reaching towards the lens. Jack slumped back in his chair in shock. He began to pant rapidly. The rotary phone was still in his hand, the silence still lingering. Then, a faint voice came through the receiver, very slowly, as if the caller was smiling as they spoke. "We told you, you're not alone." Then the line went dead. His smartphone turned off by itself. All the images disappeared. But 2 seconds later, Jack heard something, a scratch, then a harder scratch, then a loud bang from behind the wall that was a door. This time, the sound was different, closer, heavier, and hungry. After the series of terrifying images appeared on his phone, Jack sat in silence, unable to think. Everything in the house felt strange, illogical. Even the air inside the apartment seemed to be watching him. But he hadn't expected what he would find next. It would show him that what he was experiencing now hadn't started with him. While searching for something to defend himself with, he opened the old wooden cupboard in the living room, which he hadn't opened since moving in. It opened with difficulty, and inside he found old files, yellowed papers, notebooks with torn edges, and small cassette tapes covered in dust. On the first notebook, written in shaky handwriting, "To whoever comes after me, he will not leave you." Jack didn't understand. He began flipping through the pages. They were written in desperate, rushed handwriting, as if the writer had been scribbling quickly before losing control or before something attacked him. The writer didn't give his name, but from his words, it was clear that he was someone who had lived in the same house many years before, perhaps a former resident, perhaps a researcher, or someone being hunted. On page 3, he wrote, "The entity doesn't live here. It passes through here. It chooses one place to enter. Once opened, the path cannot be closed." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The path? The door that became a wall? The absolute blackness in the picture? He continued reading. The writer said, "It started with a text message, then a phone call, then the door to the room changed. The door was the entrance." Jack was breathless for a moment. This is exactly what's happening to him now. The same order, the same signs. He opened his old cassette player and tried one of the recordings. The sound was faint, intermittent, but the man's words were clear. "If it reaches your pictures, if it starts appearing in reflections, it has crossed the threshold and there's no going back." The voice on the tape was gasping, choked with words, as if the man were speaking while watching something move in front of him. Then suddenly, the recording cut out abruptly, as if someone had yanked the device from its place. He switched it off immediately. Complete silence. But at that precise moment, as he stood near the parlor window, its surface slightly condensed from the cold, he noticed something. His reflection in the glass. He wasn't alone. He was standing there, yes, but behind him, less than 2 meters away, distorted features began to take shape in the glass reflection. A long face, not human, its eyes not round but slanted backward, and its mouth larger than normal. The face was slowly approaching from behind Jack, but when he turned quickly, he saw no one. He looked back at the window. The face was still there in the reflection, but not behind him. Now he was so close to the glass surface, as if something behind the glass was trying to escape. Jack stepped back, panting. His rotary phone rang again. A long, steady ring, like an announcement of arrival. But this time the phone wasn't waiting for an answer. As soon as it rang, Jack heard from behind him, from the direction of the wall that was a door, a scratch. Then another scratch. Then a long, heavy, hot exhalation, as if it were only centimeters away. And even though he didn't turn around, he felt an absolute certainty. The thing knows it has found him. As the troubled nights piled up, Jack began to lose the ability to distinguish between sleep and wakefulness. He would wake up terrified, unsure if he had even slept at all. One night, he felt a weight pressing down on his chest and began to hear breathing close, almost as close as his left ear. He tried to move but couldn't, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a shadow sitting over him, hunched over as if studying his face closely. The shadow wasn't still. Its limbs trembled slowly, as if its form were unstable and out of place. When Jack blinked once, the shadow vanished, but its imprint remained. The impression of a large hand on his chest, as if the entity had been trying to restrain him. As the hours passed, A distorted version of him began to appear in various places around the house, in the window pane, in the reflection of the black television screen, and in the bathroom mirror. The version resembled him from afar, but it had terrifying differences. An asymmetrical smile, empty eyes, and an unnaturally long neck. The smile grew wider the more Jack tried to ignore it. In one of those moments between sleep and wakefulness, he heard his mother's voice calling to him from the kitchen, her voice broken, even though she had died years before. The voice echoed 3 times, each time sounding closer, more broken, as if emanating from the same entity that mimicked voices. Jack felt like he was acting inside a nightmare he had no control over, yet things were actually moving in reality. In one panic attack, he grabbed the old phone that had come in the box and hurled it forcefully against the wall, trying to get rid of it. The phone shattered, but the next moment, when he looked down at the floor, it was still the same. It hadn't broken. The problem was with his hand. His fingers were bleeding profusely, as if he had thrown something much heavier than a phone. The pain was real. The blood was real. As for the moment itself, he no longer knew if he was dreaming or awake. At the end of the night, Jack realized only one thing. What he saw in his nightmares was beginning to leave a physical mark on reality, as if the boundary between them no longer existed. The more he tried to ignore the voices, the closer the thing got, and the more it knew every move and every weakness within him. After a night blurred between reality and nightmare, Jack began to grasp that what was happening to him was no longer just apparitions or shadows moving in the background. There was some kind of system, a way of operating, as if the entity was waiting for him to make a specific move. Among the contents of the wooden box, he noticed something he had never before examined closely. A small piece of paper that had fallen between the boards, covered in black dust. It was folded carefully, as if someone had deliberately hidden it for someone to find at a certain point, or after a certain stage. Jack opened it cautiously. Inside, he found a strange drawing. Irregular geometric lines, twisted triangles and circles overlapping in impossible ways, as if each shape contradicted the others. Beside the drawings were words written in an unfamiliar language, long cursive letters, unlike Arabic, English, or any known human script. At the bottom of the paper was a single phrase in Arabic, written in a shaky hand. Communication is not sound, but frequency. Jack spent hours trying to decipher the meaning of the phrase. Then suddenly, he realized something. The old phone was emitting incomprehensible whispers, but the rhythm was regular, like a melody or a resonance. He opened his smartphone and recorded the rotary phone's last ring. When he ran the audio through editing software, an unnatural wave pattern emerged, a geometric repetition resembling drawings on paper, as if the phone was sending a code, a frequency that needed to be reproduced. That night, in a moment of despair, Jack played the frequency through the speaker. The sound wasn't music, nor a whisper, but a low vibration pressing on the air as if trying from within to change its shape. Suddenly, the lights went out. The house transformed into a vast, echoing room with no light source,
even though Jack was sure he was inside his small apartment. Nothing appeared, no shadow, no face, no movement.
But something worse happened. Jack began to see enormous geometric shapes moving in the space before him. They weren't three-dimensional. They were beyond that. Every angle of them existed in two directions simultaneously. Colors shifted illogically, lines expanded and contracted, then reversed themselves in a way that defied the laws of geometry. Then a vast, empty, endless space appeared, devoid of stars and darkness, just a soft void, breathing slowly. And within the void there was something, not a creature, not a form, not a shadow, but the sensation of something looking back at him from an unseen direction. The view was too vast for the human mind to comprehend. His eyes began to burn from the pressure, as if his brain refused to translate what he was seeing. The vision ended as it had begun, suddenly, without warning. He returned to the room and the lights came on. But traces of blood were trickling from his nose, his ears, and his eyes. The paper he had found in the box had turned to ash in his hand. And Jack finally understood the truth. Communication had indeed taken place. But what he had communicated with was not an entity of this world, but something larger, older, and beyond human comprehension. After his cosmic experience, Jack was no longer the same person. He no longer saw his apartment as it was, nor his life as it once was. Everything had become fragile, liable to collapse the moment he focused on it. He began to feel that his presence in this place was no accident. Coincidence doesn't send mysterious boxes. It doesn't change the shape of house doors. It doesn't open windows onto architectural visions beyond comprehension. It doesn't choose an ordinary person, unless something inside them is responding. As the days passed, Jack discovered that a part of him had always been searching for something bigger, something beyond the bounds of reality. The years of isolation he had spent as a graphic designer weren't simply a desire for comfort, but an attempt to escape a world that had become too confining. And this idea was like an old wound reopening. Doubts began to gnaw at his mind. Was he a victim, or was he somehow part of the trap? Had the thing chosen him because he was weak, or because he was willing, because he possessed a hidden desire he had never acknowledged? With each new thought, a heavy paranoia grew within him. He no longer trusted any sound from the outside world. Not the phone, not the door, not even the echo of his own footsteps. He no longer trusted his own voice. One night, he tried to ignore everything and lay down on the sofa. But before he could fully drift off, he heard a sentence emerge from the depths of darkness, in a voice that sounded like his, but wasn't his. "You called us long ago." His blood ran cold. The entity wasn't just speaking to him, it was reminding him of something he had tried to forget his entire life. The moments when he longed to know the meaning of beyond reality, to know what shouldn't be known, to enter areas forbidden to the mind. It had been a childhood wish, which, over time, had transformed into a deep-seated desire. And now, it was an open gate that could not be closed. At that moment, he felt the wall behind the transformed door begin to breathe. The air stirred slowly, as if something enormous was awakening behind the wall. The scratching sounds he had heard in previous nights had changed. They were no longer attempts to escape, but had become a harmony, as if the entity within was playing a tune on the wall that Jack knew all too well, as if they shared a memory or a single desire. And with this realization, the fear intensified. Jack was no longer sure if he was trapped in this place, or if he himself had summoned all of this to happen. He no longer knew if he wanted to survive, or if a part of him still wanted to continue communicating with what he had seen in the other dimension. In the days that followed, Jack no longer saw the phenomenon as something external pursuing him, but as a force waiting for his decision. He kept trying to ignore the whispers, the voices, the changing shapes of the doors and walls, but every attempt only intensified his feeling that the darkness was no longer just an intruder, but was waiting for something from him. One night, when the house was unnaturally dark, he heard the old telephone ring. This time, the sound wasn't just coming from the receiver. The light around him seemed to vibrate, as if the entire apartment was responding to the ringing. He slowly picked up the receiver. He heard no words, only deep, ragged breaths in time with his heartbeat. Then came a low, inhuman voice. The offering, the final step. Jack froze. He expected them to ask him for something physical, something terrifying, but he didn't hear the words blood or body. He heard something worse. The most precious thing your soul holds. He didn't understand at first, but the house gave him the answer. He began to see images everywhere, on the window pane, in the reflection of the television screen, on the edges of the mirror. A single memory kept appearing, a memory he clung to as his last refuge, the laughter of a small child, a face he had tried to forget for years because it hurt him. It was his little brother, whom he had lost years before. He had never spoken of him, never allowed himself to recall the details. That memory was the only thing that held a shred of his humanity. The house was telling him, this is the offering, not a body, not blood, but something inside his soul, the last link that reminded him he was human, that he had once been part of a normal life. He sat on the floor, his hand trembling on the phone. He refused. Inside, a scream raged, unheard by anyone. But the darkness wasn't waiting for his consent. The breaths behind the wall grew louder. The scratches became taps, as if something huge was knocking from within, drawing closer, demanding, waiting. Jack felt for the first time that his own mind had become part of the bargain. It was no longer just a memory. There was a real danger. Perhaps the sacrifice required was his very mind, to surrender the last glimmer of light within him, to allow darkness to take its place. He spent the entire night hesitating, caught between two choices: to lose the last thing that kept him human, or to allow the phenomenon to grow until it consumed him entirely. He didn't know which was worse, but one thing was certain: a decision had to be made, and the darkness wouldn't wait any longer. And in an instant, he felt it. The entity was closer than ever. The night after Jack hesitated to offer the Eucharist, something profound changed in the house. The voices no longer whispered, they fell silent. The walls no longer scratched, they were still. And the telephone no longer rang. The silence was heavier than any sound he had ever heard. A silence that pressed against his chest, as if trying to rip the air from his lungs. He sat on the sofa, unconsciously, waiting for something. He didn't know what, but he felt it coming. Then, in complete silence, all the lights went out, except for a single dim light coming from the hallway. There, standing in the shadows, it was the entity. It wasn't a monster, it wasn't a shadow or a black mass. It appeared as an elegant, tall man wearing a dark coat, his features eerily serene. His face was devoid of any real expression. No anger, no hatred, no ferocity. Only a calmness that didn't match what was happening. The most terrifying thing, it looked like Jack, but an improved version, a deeper gaze.
A calmer one, and more empty. It took the first step. It made no sound, but the words sank into Jack's mind like a whisper inside his skull. Why are you afraid? Jack didn't move. He couldn't. The entity moved closer. You've been tormented for years. Loneliness, guilt, loss. You haven't lived. You've just stayed. The tone was dangerous because it was devoid of emotion. Not trying to scare him or appease him, but trying to persuade him. The entity sat quietly in the chair opposite him, clasped his hands together, and leaned slightly forward. Existence is constant pain, Jack. You know it. And everything you're trying to defend is just a broken memory. Jack felt his brain squeezing. It was as if the words weren't words, but claws digging inside him, testing his vulnerabilities. I'm not here to hurt you, the entity said, raising its gaze. I'm here to save you. He raised his hand calmly and pointed at Jack's head. All you need is to stop resisting, to let yourself slip away from this weight. Nothingness is not death, it's rest. The last sentence was like a slap in the face. The entity didn't want to kill him. It didn't want to take his body or his soul. It wanted his surrender. It wanted Jack to accept that nothingness was better than life. The entity took another step closer. Shadows began to move behind him. wrapping around his feet, slowly rising as if trying to form a new body for him. "You are not a victim, Jack." It stopped in front of him. "Your old desire, your desire to escape, opened the door." Jack felt a cold terror run through him. The words were terrifyingly true. He couldn't reply. He couldn't even think. The entity leaned close to his ear and smiled a faint, calm, deadly smile. "Come, you deserve to be freed." Jack had only one choice: to surrender to the quiet nothingness, or to confront something he didn't understand, something that took shape and knew his deepest weaknesses.
A week later, Jack found himself at his desk. He thought he was back at his job as a designer, but when he looked at the paper in front of him, he froze. He was writing. Symbols, circles, curved lines. The same patterns he'd seen in photos on the old phone, in his dreams. Even worse, there were handwritten notes, but he couldn't remember when he'd written them. "When it rings, answer. A door isn't a wall. A wall isn't a door. He doesn't want to kill you. He just wants you to remember." He slowly raised his head. The room around him began to change subtly. The light grew darker. The door looked different, like the first time. It was back, but this time, no longer was an entity waiting for him. Instead, he was part of it, the point that shattered everything. At that moment, he heard a soft knock on his door. The same knocks he'd heard at the beginning of the nightmare. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He smiled. An empty smile, a quiet one, like the entity's. He walked over to the door and placed his hand on the handle. But before he opened it, he whispered, "Is suffering the only end?" He paused for a second. Then he continued in a low voice, not fearful, but with terrifying certainty. "Or am I already dead from the beginning?" He opened the door, and at that moment, darkness returned. But this time, Jack wasn't a victim. He was part of the story. He was its author. He was the one who sent the box to someone new. The story wasn't over.